Hey there. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment just for yourself. Let today fall away, piece by piece. This moment is yours. Let the glow around you soften. Let the room hold you. Maybe turn on a fan, just low enough for that gentle background hum. Or a white noise in the background, something steady, like rain on stone. Let your body find stillness. Unclench your jaw. Let your tongue rest gently against the roof of your mouth. Drop your shoulders. Let the tension melt from your neck. Feel the weight of your arms, your legs, your whole self sink a little deeper into wherever you are. Let your breath slow in through your nose and out like a quiet wave on a shore. You don't have to listen closely. You don't have to hold onto every word. This story will carry you. And if you enjoy drifting through history with me, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now then, the fire is low, the coals are dim. A hush settles over ancient stone, and somewhere beneath a vaulted sky of candlelight and crown, the ghosts of kings still whisper. But tonight, we don't walk with kings. We don't sit in marble atriums or stroll beneath golden arches. We slip past them, down narrow alleys, past closed shutters and curling oil smoke. We descend a little deeper, to the room's history tried to forget. Because tonight, we step behind a heavy wooden door, set in old stone, worn smooth by 1,000 palms. The hinges whisper open. Inside, flickering torchlight, cool walls, the rustle of linen, and life that lived loudly in silence. This is not the Rome of Caesars. This is the Rome of working women, of coins and glances, of hours that stretch into the dark. A life carved not in marble, but in routine. So lie back, let your breath slow. Congratulations, you've just woken up. In the era of Roman brothels, we begin now, with the rhythm of footsteps and the soft creak of a door. The floors were cold, always cold, even in the heat of a Roman summer. The stone trapped the chill of night and held it through the long mornings. Workers would step barefoot or in thin sandals across cracked thresholds, their feet already tired before the first client arrived. The space was narrow, not grand, not hidden either. Brothels in Rome were practical, often built into the base of tenement buildings, a single corridor, lined with cramped rooms, each one just big enough for a stone bed and perhaps a lamp. The walls were thick, but the sounds still traveled. Each morning began early. Before the city stirred, water had to be fetched, the floors swept, the linen checked, oil lamps cleaned, not by the clients, but by the workers themselves. Many were enslaved. Some were debt-bound. Few had chosen this path freely. They bathed in public fountains, or with a shared basin in the corner of the lupanar. Soap was rare. Olive oil scrubbed the skin, then scraped clean with a strigil. Cold water followed. Faces were painted, cheeks rouged, hair styled with pins or braids. It was all part of the expectation to appear pleasing, to disguise the fatigue, to step into a role. There were no days off, no weekends. Work was constant. From noon until the last drunken soldier stumbled out. Some days brought 5 clients, some brought 20. There was no union, no protection, just the hope of an easier night. Meals were quick. Bread, olives, if they were lucky, maybe a bit of cheese. Wine diluted with water, drunk not for pleasure, but for endurance, for warmth, for forgetting. Payment rarely went into their hands. Most of it belonged to the owner, the Leno or Lena, sometimes a former worker, sometimes just a business person. They ran the house, set the rules, chose the prices, monitored the entrances. Sometimes they paid guards, sometimes they paid the magistrates. The walls of the Lupaner were alive, not just with footsteps, but with writing. Graffiti was everywhere, scratched into the plaster, by clients, by workers, by wanderers. Some were names, some were boasts, some were prices, some were insults. A living diary, worn by time and laughter and shame. The bed was not soft, it was stone, covered with a thin blanket, sometimes two. There was no privacy, a curtain maybe, but no door, only a threshold. The lamp burned low, shadows danced on the walls. The act was brief, often impersonal, a routine, a performance, a transaction, but not always. Sometimes a client lingered, talked, cried, brought a gift, promised to return. Some did, some vanished. There were regulars. Some were kind, some were not. Some workers found ways to build small routines, a charm under the blanket, a whispered prayer before each visit, a pattern of combing their hair just so. These became anchors in a life that shifted each hour. Injuries happened. Illness was constant. The city was crowded. Disease passed easily. There were healers, but not always trusted. Sometimes a fellow worker knew herbs, or wrapped wounds, or stayed up with someone through a fever. Friendships formed, quietly, in whispered jokes, shared bread, a touch of the hand when no one watched. These were precious, rare, but real. They helped workers survive, gave them something to return to. Pregnancy was feared, not celebrated. There were potions, charms, old remedies. Some worked, some did not. A child meant less freedom, more cost. Sometimes a child was taken, sold, sometimes raised by another in the brothel, sometimes not spoken of again. At the end of the day, there was no applause, no rest, just the scraping of lamps, the counting of coins, the rubbing of sore feet, the laying down on stone, wrapped in whatever cloth was clean, and the closing of tired eyes, until the sun rose again, and again, and again. Some workers were brought from distant provinces, Gaul, Syria, Numidia. They spoke different tongues, wore different jewelry, brought different scents. Some became favorites for their difference. Others were mocked, treated as foreign, as curiosities, not as people. The Lupaner was a theater, but not one of joy. Roles were strict, smiles were practiced, rejections were dangerous. Laughter was controlled. Each client could mean survival or harm. A worker had to read the signs quickly, adjust, adapt, protect themselves as best they could. Sometimes a worker would save enough, or be granted manumission, freedom, a paper signed by a magistrate, witnessed, sealed, and then what? Some opened small shops, selling perfumes or cloth. Some vanished, left the city. Some returned as owners, as Lenas. They had survived, but the past never fully left. It lingered in glances, in walk, in the way they counted coins. And still, each day, new footsteps on the stone, new names whispered, new marks scratched into the plaster. The brothel never emptied. It only changed its faces, and so the Lupaner endured, as constant as the Forum, as inevitable as the bathhouse, as Roman as the Legion. Yet beneath the routine, beneath the noise, were lives, beating hearts, quiet hopes, faded dreams. You would not last a day here, not because of the work, but because of the silence after. The silence when the door closes and the city forgets your name. But they remembered each other, in glances, in touches, in scratched messages hidden behind the lamps. They were not statues, they were not shame, they were people, and they lived. Not all Roman brothels were the same. Some were small, just a single room behind a tavern. Others were larger, multi-roomed, hidden behind false walls or tucked beneath insulae, but all shared one truth, that the labor inside was real, exhausting, and rarely romantic. In the larger houses, there was hierarchy. Some workers were considered more desirable, perhaps for youth, perhaps for features, perhaps simply because they had endured longer. Those at the top might receive more attention, slightly better cloth, a slightly softer mat, a slightly larger share of the coin. But even then, the difference was small. Workers came and went. Some were traded between owners, like ledgers, moved from one district to another, not always knowing where they were going, just that the faces would be new and the work would be the same. There were rituals, quiet ones, unwritten, known only to those inside. A certain way of tying a sash, a whisper before the first client, a stone placed under the bed for luck. These small acts gave a sense of control, a rhythm, a thread of meaning in a life shaped by others. The lupanar was not only a workplace, it was a cage, a shelter, a stage, a trap, a refuge, sometimes all in the same hour. The emotions were layered, complex. A worker could feel pride in surviving and sorrow in continuing. They could laugh, even while enduring. They could love, even within limits. And yes, there was love. Not often, not openly, but it happened. Between workers, between a worker and a client. It rarely lasted, it rarely ended well, but for a moment, it gave light. Sometimes clients believed they were loved. They returned again and again, left tokens, promised freedom, a better life, a villa outside the city, a shop, a ring. Some meant it, most did not. But still, hope bloomed, quietly, cautiously, until it did not. Clothing was important. It sent messages. Workers did not wear the togas of citizens. They were not allowed. Instead, light tunics, often dyed or trimmed to suggest allure. Fabrics were reused, washed and rewashed, embroidered sometimes, with symbols or initials. There was no standard, just the silent language of presentation. Perfume-covered sweat, sometimes jasmine, sometimes myrrh, sometimes cheap oils that clung too long. It masked exhaustion. It drew the nose before the eye, a calculated appeal. Some brothels displayed painted images above each room. These were not portraits, but illustrations of different acts, used as advertisements or selections. Clients would choose based on image, then step into the room beneath it. But the images were also stories, repeating poses, frozen gestures, softly smiling faces. They were art, but also tools and reminders of what was expected. Clients varied. Soldiers were common, loud, often crude. Traveling merchants came to 10 with strange coins and foreign curses. Locals, young men celebrating their first rites of adulthood. Older men seeking routine. All left their marks, some respectful, some rough, some forgettable, others impossible to forget. There were laws, officially. The Roman state regulated brothels, registered workers, collected taxes. Intimacy was not hidden, It was business, a recognized part of city life. Yet, despite regulation, protection was rare, justice rarer still. Abuse happened without consequence. Violence was part of the risk. Some brothels hired muscle, but only to protect the owner's property, not the people. And yet, life continued, day after day, year after year. New workers arrived. Old ones disappeared. The walls held their voices, the floor their steps, the air their breath. Music sometimes floated in from nearby streets. Flutes, lutes, the call of a fruit seller, the rumble of cartwheels. The city never fully silenced, even at midnight, and in the small hours after the final client, after the lamps were dimmed, after the last coin was dropped in a jar. Some workers would sit together on the edge of their beds or on the steps just outside. They would whisper, eat a bit of leftover bread, look at the stars between rooftops. They would share stories, dreams, what they remembered of home, a father's voice, a river's sound, the shape of a mountain, the taste of a fruit they had not eaten in years. These were sacred, these small memories. They kept the spirit from folding. Sometimes they would laugh, quietly, shoulders shaking, hands over mouths, laughing not at joy, but at absurdity, at the clients, at the owners, at the absurd repetition of it all. Laughter as survival. And when dawn began to soften the skyline, when the city shifted in its sleep, they would rise, stretch sore limbs, prepare again. The world did not stop for them, so they did not stop. Some tried to run, escape. Few succeeded. Those who did became stories, told in hushed tones. A girl who climbed the wall, a boy who bribed the guard, a pair who vanished into the crowd during a festival. Whether these tales were true did not matter. They were necessary. The Lupaner was a world within a world, its own language, its own rules, its own time. Outside, the Senate debated. Generals marched. Emperors rose and fell. Inside, linen was folded. Lamps were trimmed. Names were whispered, then forgotten. And now, centuries later, the stones still stand, scratched with names, faded with age. But if you place your hand upon them, close your eyes, listen closely, you might still hear them. A soft laugh, a footstep, a sigh. You might hear a life, not glamorous, not free, but human, always human. The sun rests gently over Pompeii. It does not shine harshly here. It lingers, warm, like the memory of a touch. The stones absorb the light, and the air hums with stillness, as if holding its breath, waiting, remembering. The city sleeps beneath ash now but once. It was alive, noisy, busy, a living pulse. Traders shouting, carts rattling, the shuffle of sandals on paved stone, the smell of fresh bread, of wine, of sweat, of life lived close together at the heart of a narrow street. There is a doorway, low, square, framed in darkened stone. You step through it, and you are no longer in the present. You are in the Lupaner. It is still here, Pompeii's most famous brothel, preserved by catastrophe, sealed by Vesuvius, a place of labor, of routine, of unvarnished life. The ash did not only preserve walls, it preserved hours, movements, smiles that never lasted, coins exchanged in silence. The corridor is tight, walls close on either side. You can reach out and touch both. There are 10 rooms, each with a stone bed, each just large enough to lie down. The doorways are open, always open. No wooden doors remain. Perhaps there never were any. On the walls, draped cloth, curved bodies in practiced gestures. These are not decorations, they are a language, a menu, a promise. They told visitors what to expect, what could be requested, what was offered. But they also speak now, across centuries, of how intimacy was framed, how labor was sold, how performance was etched into plaster. The beds are not soft, you can see that, even now, solid stone, unforgiving. Only the thinnest of pads once softened them. A worker would lie there, again and again, year after year, until their name faded and their bones ached, and someone else took their place. Graffiti covers the walls. Names, boasts, jokes, prices, preferences, wishes, some scratched deep, others light and quick. They are everywhere, layered like voices, talking over one another. One reads, Felix was here. Another, Myrtis is the best. Another simply, I was here. You stand in silence, reading these. They are not profound, but they are real. They are marks of presence, of passing, a way of saying, I existed, I mattered, for a moment, to someone. The light inside is dim, even now, with the roof open. It feels shadowed, tucked away, the kind of space where time bends, where it is always late, where footsteps echo more loudly than they should. Imagine the workers walking these halls, carrying water, straightening cloth, preparing for the next client. The same steps each day, the same threshold, the same flickering lamp. They may have smiled, they may have frowned, they may have joked with one another, shared food, shared silence, shared a glance in the dark. One fresco shows a woman reclining, one arm above her head. Her eyes are half closed, but her face does not smile. It is a mask, still, composed, practiced. Another shows a man leaning forward, his face hidden, his hand open. The image fades at the edges, the past peeling back into dust. In the small alcove near the back, there is a basin, possibly used for washing, possibly for ritual. No one is certain. The brothel held many secrets and kept most of them. The workers lived upstairs, cramped rooms, shared beds, no privacy, no softness, just a place to collapse between shifts, to rest sore limbs, to dream of somewhere else. But some chose to decorate. Traces of colored plaster, a bit of cloth, a flower pressed into a crevice, signs of self, of personhood. Even in the narrowest life, outside, the street bore no sign, no announcement. The lupanar was known by scent, by sound, by habit. Strangers were quickly informed, and yet it was not hidden. There was no shame, not in the Roman sense. The services were part of life, part of the city's rhythm, as common as the bakery, as accepted as the bathhouse. Children walked by. Merchants leaned against the wall to rest. Street performers played flutes nearby. The lupanar was not a shadowed secret. It was a public whisper. Inside, time thickens. The air is heavy. The frescoes stare back. The graffiti chants its chorus. The beds remain cold, hard, waiting. And yet, there is dignity here. Not in the labor, not in the pain, but in the endurance, in the humanity, in the small acts of defiance, in the scratched names that refused to be forgotten. They carved themselves into history, not with glory, but with presence, and the ash, when it fell, preserved them without warning, without mercy. The city froze, and the lupanar became a monument. Not to Rome's greatness, but to its reality. You can still walk there. Your sandals echo where theirs once did. Your breath stirs the dust of centuries, and the silence presses close. They are gone, but they are not absent, not entirely. Their rooms remain, their names remain, and through ash and time and stone, if you step carefully past the frescoes, past the crumbled past the names carved in haste, you will find quiet corners where the city's voice thins into whispers, where imagination takes the lead, and where the weight of what once happened here presses just a little heavier on the air. There is a rhythm to the brothel's construction, an almost architectural heartbeat. 10 small rooms, 2 levels, a modest entrance tucked off a lively street, yet every detail tells a story of thought, of purpose, of labor not seen as sacred, but certainly counted, tallied, measured. Even the placement of the frescoes suggests this. They are not random. They are carefully arranged, each image framed above a threshold, each one facing outward, as though inviting the client to choose not just a room, but an experience, a fantasy, a moment of imagined control, even as the worker inside had none. The artists who painted these scenes were not unknown. They were hired, paid, perhaps not well, but they left their mark, their brushstrokes, their choices. The pigments are mostly iron oxide, ochre, charcoal, the colors of earth and blood. Some say the red was meant to arouse. Others say it simply lasted longer under heat. Both may be true. The figures in the paintings are strangely still. Despite their gestures, they do not move. They do not breathe. They resemble statues more than people, and that is fitting, because that is what Pompeii has become, a museum of motionless lives, preserved in their most vulnerable moment. It is tempting to think of these images as exotic, as scandalous, but they are more than decoration. They are part of the architecture of service, of expectation, a silent list of transactions, painted in strokes and shadow. Visitors today often pause longest in these rooms. Tourists lean close, whisper, take pictures. They rarely imagine the cold of the bed, the weight of the expectation, the sore muscles, the long nights. They see the painting, but not the person who once slept beneath it. Imagine her, or him, or them, waking with sore limbs, listening to the sound of footsteps in the corridor, knowing the day had begun, knowing the routine would continue, knowing their name might be scratched on the wall, or forgotten entirely, and still they endured. We find evidence of their lives not just in the rooms, but in the graffiti. Some of it is boastful, some crude, but some is tender, a simple name, a heart, a line that reads, "Myrtis pleases all." Was that written by a client, or by Myrtis herself? A declaration, a hope, a bit of branding? It is impossible to know. That is the beauty and the sorrow of Pompeii. The ash preserved the shape, but not the voice. The upper level of the brothel is harder to reach now. The stairs partially collapsed. But scholars believe this is where the workers slept, if you can call it sleep. Cramped quarters, thin mattresses, no privacy, just a space to close your eyes for a few hours before beginning again. These rooms had no frescoes, no decorations, no names scratched into the walls. They were not meant for visitors. They were not meant to impress. They were meant to contain, to compress, to hide the wariness of the people who lived there. In some rooms, tiny artifacts were found, a ring, a hairpin, a fragment of cloth. These are the details that make history human, that lift it from record into memory. Pompei Sluipner was not unique, but it is singular in its survival. The volcanic ash turned it into a time capsule, while other brothels crumbled or were replaced. this one remains, almost stubbornly, and with it we have a window, not just into Roman work, but into Roman indifference. How commonplace this kind of labor was, how unremarkable, and yet how essential, because it is the unremarkable that often tells us the most. The brothel was not a place of celebration, nor necessarily of shame. It was a workplace, plain and simple. For many, it was the only option. For others, it was a punishment. For a few, perhaps, it was a choice. But even choice was a luxury in ancient Rome, reserved for the wealthy, the powerful, the protected. And yet, here in the dust, we see glimpses of resistance, of survival, of tiny defiance, a flower drawn in charcoal, a sentence that reads, "She laughed," a face painted with care, a sandal placed just so beside the bed. They were not allowed to own the space, but they made it theirs. Now, as you step back out into the Pompeian street, the noise of modern life returns. The camera clicks, the murmur of tourists, the rustle of maps and plastic water bottles. But the air still holds something, a weight, a breath, a pause. You were just inside a memory that refused to fade. And for a moment, you did not just see history, you walked through it. The wind changes when you step away from Pompeii, when you leave behind the stone rooms, the ash-covered streets, the fixed gaze of painted eyes. You find yourself drifting east, toward temples, toward incense, toward cities older than Rome, toward stories told in marble and smoke. In the world of antiquity, sacredness and service were not separate. Intimacy and divinity often touched, in whispers, in rituals, in offerings, not only of grain and song, but sometimes of bodies. We begin in Mesopotamia, cradle of cities, of ziggurats rising like stairways to the heavens, of priest-kings and stargazers in the temples of Ishtar, the goddess of love, of war, of storms and renewal. Rituals unfolded beneath the weight of devotion. Travelers spoke of women who served her, who adorned themselves with gold and scent, who sat upon sacred benches, waiting, not for worshippers, but for offerings of coin, not for marriage, but for encounter, one not rooted in passion, but in right. It is difficult now to know what was true and what was imagined. Ancient accounts contradict. Some claim thousands served the goddess this way. Others call it slander, a misunderstanding, a metaphor stretched too far. But somewhere in between, in that ambiguity, lies a truth of its own, that the line between sacred and shameful, between ritual and requirement, was not clearly drawn in the Greek world. The idea persisted. In Corinth, in Cyprus, in Eryx, temples dedicated to Aphrodite stood at the edge of commerce and sanctity. Pilgrims came to offer coin, not only for prayers, but for touch, for presence, for temporary union with someone thought to carry the goddess's favor. The women, sometimes called temple companions, were not enslaved in every case. Some may have chosen the role. Some were raised in the temple, trained in art, in music, in language, in gesture. They were not unnamed. Some were poets, some were patrons, some were educators of men. Yet choice is always a question, even wrapped in silk, even within a marble courtyard. When a role is ritualized, when a body becomes a vessel of worship, can it be offered freely, or is it shaped by centuries of expectation? In Rome, the traditions took a different form, less openly ritualized, more structured by law. But the echoes remained. Vestals served the state, but their purity was guarded by threat. A broken vow did not end in exile. It ended in burial, alive beneath the earth, a ritual punishment for a sacred breach. Elsewhere, in temples to Venus, services were rendered, but cloaked, discreet, sometimes in annexes, sometimes in private rooms. Donations were recorded, but motives rarely questioned. To the outside eye, it may have seemed elevated, beautified, wrapped in divine language. But for those inside, for the women who waited behind incense screens, for the men who stood beneath torchlight, for those who bowed not in worship, but in obligation, the line between devotion and labor was not so clean. The architecture tells a quiet story. In some temples, the outer court is grand, open, majestic, but behind the curtain, rooms narrow, ceilings lower. The space becomes personal, intimate, less for worship, more for transaction. Stone does not lie, even when the priests do. There are stories of priestesses who wept after ceremony, who prayed in secret to be released, who wrote poems in the margins of scrolls, asking not for favor, but for freedom. And yet, there are also tales of honor, of pride, of lineage, women who saw their role as sacred, not sullied, who stood with heads high, who counseled kings, who held power, however briefly, because the sacred, like the profane, was always entangled in status. A high-born woman in a temple was seen as chosen, a poor woman in the street as fallen. Yet both may have performed the same acts for the same price, with the same heart. Intimacy in the ancient world was never just personal. It was social, political, economic. It was a thread in the fabric of identity, of law, of family, of myth, and temples. For all their chants and columns were not outside that system. Even in India, in the Devadasi tradition, girls were dedicated to temples, taught to dance, to sing, to serve deities with their presence. For centuries, they were revered, protected, patronized, but over time, that reverence waned. The practice became commodified, the line blurred, and what began as a sacred offering became a trade, a burden, a loss. Sacredness is fragile. It can be used, shaped, reframed, especially when it hides labor, especially when it cloaks control. And so we must ask, who wrote the rituals? Who benefited? Who watched? And who could not leave? When the altar becomes a marketplace, when worship becomes work, what remains sacred? Perhaps the only true sanctity was in the resilience, in the moments stolen between ceremony, in the quiet acts of resistance. A prayer said not for the God, but for the self. A gesture performed not with devotion, but with weariness. And still it was done. Even now, as we read the inscriptions, as we walk temple ruins, the truth is obscured. The records were written by those who watched, not by those who served. The workers, the companions, the temple women, their voices are faint, but not gone. They remain in the curves of statues, in the soot on sacred lamps, in the worn stones where bare feet once stood. They remain. In the silence that follows the chant, they remain, waiting to be seen. The temples are still now, empty of chants, empty of footfall. The birds roost where once flames flickered. Dust gathers on altars where fragrant oil once burned. And in that stillness, in that forgetting, something of the truth lingers. Imagine a temple at dawn, somewhere in Delphi, or Carthage, or Babylon, a courtyard still cold from the night, marble steps damp with morning air. A figure kneels, not to pray, but to prepare, to light the incense, to set the offerings, to ready the space not for the divine, but for the eyes of men. There is always an audience in the sacred, always a gaze. And for many temple servants, that gaze was constant, measured, calculated. Those who watched saw beauty, obedience, grace. They did not see the sore feet, the early rising, the rituals performed again and again until the gestures became muscle memory, until the prayers became whispers spoken without thought, a performance wrapped in holiness. There are records, sparse and broken, of temple registries, of donations marked beside names, of girls initiated at young ages, given to the gods by families who could not afford dowries or who sought divine favor. Sometimes a girl was considered lucky, honored, a daughter of the temple. She wore robes dyed in costly colors, learned the hymns, learned the flute. Her hair was perfumed, her feet washed by attendants, but the cost always was invisibly written. No one asked her where she would rather be. It is a quiet kind of disempowerment, the kind hidden behind gold veils and ritual phrases, the kind made palatable by myth, by architecture, by centuries of repetition. Yet it was not always so bleak in some temples. The companions became powerful, held property, commissioned art, advised rulers. Their influence extended beyond the sanctuary walls. And for a brief moment in history, their voices mattered. In ancient Uruk, in the shadow of Inanna's ziggurat, some priestesses were recorded as owning land. Their signatures appear beside contracts. They controlled temple wealth, issued orders. It was rare, but it happened. Still, most remained invisible. Those without rank, without education, without family names. Their names were not etched into clay tablets. Their stories survive only in echoes. In questions, historians still ask with uncertainty, with caution, were they volunteers? Were they coerced? Was the ritual ever truly sacred to them? Or was it work, performed, repeated? The ambiguity persists. In Egypt, some temples housed women who lived within the sacred compound. They served Hathor, the goddess of joy, of dance, of beauty. They played sistrums in processions, sang in bright linen. But the records do not explain the full extent of their duties. We are left to infer, to imagine. There is power in beauty, and danger in it too. The same flower that adorns an altar can be crushed beneath a sandal. In the Roman world, the goddess Venus held sway over many hearts and bodies. Temples to her name were scattered from Hispania. Some were grand, some little more than shrines beside roads. Offerings were left, prayers whispered, and at times services requested. But Rome was practical. What was divine could also be taxable, recorded, regulated. The temple servant became an economic unit, her worth measured in copper and silver, not in devotion, the sacred, monetized. And still, she may have believed in the goddess, in her role, in her purpose. Belief and burden are not always separate. There are stories of Roman matrons who came to the temples not to give, but to take, to consult, to seek guidance, sometimes to seek comfort. They would speak to the priestess, ask her to interpret dreams, to bless a child, to ease a worry. In those moments, something sacred did emerge, not in the ritual, but in the exchange, in the human connection. Not every temple moment was transaction. Some were communion. Even so, it is the system that matters most, the system that assigned value, that assigned role, that held a person within stone walls and called it holy. We must ask, as we wander these ruins, Who was allowed to leave? Who was allowed to speak? Who lit the candles and then disappeared? The blurred line between sacred and service is not a flaw of the past alone. It echoes even now in how we define worth, in how we understand labor, in how we frame devotion. The women of the temple lived in that blur, neither wholly revered nor entirely condemned, always dependent on who told the story and why. Today, we find broken statues of them, faces smoothed by time, their eyes gone, their mouths faded, and still they seem to look at us, not with reproach, but with knowing. They have seen centuries of misunderstanding, of romanticizing, of forgetting, and they remain not saints, not sinners, but people. The Roman world did not blush, not in the way we might expect. It flaunted, displayed, etched its indulgences into walls and monuments. What other cultures might whisper, Rome said aloud, with marble, with bronze, with laughter echoing down wine-stained corridors. And yet, beneath that boldness, there was calculation. For the elite, every act carried weight. Every pleasure was a performance, and a brothel visit, though common, was never just private, it was political. We begin not in shadow, but in light, in the villa of a senator. Mosaic floors, reclining couches, silver dishes clinking as servants refill goblets, the air thick with perfume and ambition. Here, among the powerful, companionship was expected, assumed. A man of status might speak openly about his visits to a lupanar, might even boast in certain company. It did not mark him as immoral, but as virile, worldly, decisive, but only if he followed the rules, only if his behavior aligned with expectation, if he paid properly, chose companions beneath his station, avoided entanglements, because while indulgence was tolerated, even admired, loss of control was not. To become entangled, to feel, to elevate the worker in public, these were breaches, not of law, but of custom, of hierarchy. And in Rome, hierarchy was sacred. A senator might visit a brothel, but not fall in love with a servant. A general might speak of his conquests, but not elevate a companion to wife. To do so invited mockery, whispers, the slow erosion of respect. Yet some did, emperors especially. Power, after all, softens the rules. Tiberius was said to keep entire villas filled with companions, not in brothels, but in his private retreats, where walls were high and discretion higher. Caligula, Nero, Domitianich, in turn, was accused of extravagance, of indecency, of forgetting the thin thread between man and God. But the truth is harder to grasp. For some emperors, companions were entertainment. For others, they were solace. Not all pleasure was cruel. Not all visits were for boasting. A senator might return again and again to the same room, the same worker, sit a little longer, speak of matters beyond the body. And in those moments, a new kind of transaction occurred, not measured in coin, but in silence, in understanding. Still, such softness had no place in the records. It was not carved into history. What remained were the laws, the punishments, the structure. Roman law permitted much, but classified carefully. The Lex Julia, the great moral law of Augustus, drew firm lines: who could be with whom, when, why. Marriage was sacred. But so too was hierarchy. A freeborn Roman woman of status could not serve in a brothel, but a slave, a freedwoman, a foreigner. These roles were not protected. They could serve, and they did, not always in hidden places. Some brothels catered to the elite, with tiled floors, warm lighting, musicians, privacy. A man might arrive cloaked, but not ashamed. He would speak with the madam, select from a list. Some companions trained to recite poetry, to sing, to speak of politics. Not unlike the Greek Hetaira, the companion who entertained at symposia, who learned to shape conversation as art, whose value lay in more than the body. These women were not anonymous. Some became famous, their names repeated in letters, in satire, in gossip. They walked a thin line between adoration and ridicule, and for some, that attention translated into power. To be desired by a senator, a princeps, a philosopher was a currency of its own, but it could vanish quickly. One wrong word, one rumor, and the favor disappeared in Rome as in the provinces. Reputation was as fragile as glass, yet even in fragility, the elite sought pleasure endlessly. They built it into their architecture, into their baths, into their feasts, in the domus of the wealthy. It was not uncommon for workers to be kept nearby, not just for cleaning, but for companionship, readily available, unquestioned. The term literally delights was used not only for children or pets, but sometimes for people, owned, displayed, enjoyed. It is a cold word, but it reveals something, that for many Romans of means, companionship was a possession, not a meeting. And so the lupanar, the brothel, served a function beyond physical release. It reinforced power. It allowed the elite to perform control, to step into a place where their money meant dominance, where their whims shaped another's evening. Yet not all experiences followed the script. There are records, thin, faded, of Roman men who broke form, who freed companions, who fell in love, who married outside their class, and the city whispered, but life continued. Rome was vast, its customs complex. One man's scandal was another's poetry. In the end, the brothel was not only a place of transaction, but of revelation. It revealed what power does in private, what status seeks in secret, what a man believes he deserves when no one is watching. The elite used brothels not only for pleasure, but for identity, to remind themselves of who they were, and who others were not. And the companions, the workers, the silent ones, they understood. They watched men arrive in fine sandals, covered in perfume and pride. They listened, they remembered, they endured, because endurance was the true performance. And when the coins were counted, when the door closed, when the candle burned low, they remained, knowing that even emperors are fleeting. But the work, the waiting, the knowing, that remained longer still. The Roman elite did not hide their appetite. They structured their world around it. They carved it into stone, wove it into poetry, whispered it into law. And the places that served those appetites were often adorned, maintained, improved. Some brothels catered only to the wealthy, tucked behind colonnades, nestled in garden courtyards, close to theaters or libraries. The journey from speech to satisfaction was often a short one for the elite. Companionship could begin at a banquet, continue with a walk beneath fig trees, and conclude in a candlelit room where the cushions were velvet, the wine still warm, the air heavy with myrrh. Everything was arranged for them. The companion bathed, instructed, waiting, and yet the power was rarely absolute. A senator could command, but not always charm. A wealthy man could pay, but not be remembered kindly. And among companions, there were hierarchies, too. Some refused certain clients. Some were known to be selective. Some became favorites of a particular house or a particular poet. Fame was fragile, the satirist juvenile, the philosopher Seneca, even Cicero wrote about companionship, sometimes as warning, sometimes as indulgence, sometimes with scorn. Their words paint a picture, not of intimacy, but of class, of anxiety, of men fearing softness, fearing the loss of control. To fall in love with a companion was considered foolish, weak, and yet many did. There are letters carved onto tablets, left at shrines, prayers for the return of a favorite, vows to free a companion, to marry her, to take her away from the brothel. Sometimes these were granted, sometimes not, because even the elite were bound, not by chains, but by reputation, and Rome's eyes were everywhere, still, within the walls of private villas. The rules softened. Emperors often kept companions near, not just for the night, but for months, years, a familiar face in unfamiliar power. Domitian's wife was said to know of his preferences, to tolerate, to ignore, to endure, as was expected, and among the imperial court, many learned to do the same. The brothel was not just a location, it was a symbol, a backdrop for countless dramas, political, emotional, spiritual, and beyond the capital, in the provinces. In Africa, proconsularis Roman officers mimicked the habits of home. They built small brothels, staffed them, decorated them, extended their status even in exile. The same frescoes appeared, the same names scratched into walls, the same poetry, half crude, half tender. Rome traveled, and its appetites traveled with it, even in distant outposts. Companionship marked time, marked status. It was a comfort, a reminder of the city. But perhaps most telling was how Rome remembered these places, rarely with shame, more often with nostalgia. There are mosaics showing brothel scenes, displayed not in brothels, but in dining rooms. A guest might sip wine while gazing at a scene of laughter and leisure, a painted girl, a reclining figure, a suggestion. It was art, but also memory, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been purchased, lost, longed for. Even the gods were not separate. Priapus, god of fertility, guardian of gardens and thresholds, was often invoked in these spaces. His statues placed near doorways, both humorous and symbolic, a reminder that pleasure was divine, but also dangerous, and for the elite, this duality was understood. A man could indulge, but he must not surrender. He could pay for affection, but not fall into need. He could boast of conquests, but not be conquered by feeling. And so the brothel remained, a stage, a mirror, reflecting not only desire, but fear, because beneath the silks and laughter lay something unspoken, that pleasure could become dependence, that a companion could see the man more clearly than his peers, that power, even here, could falter. And so the elite wrapped their visits in humor, in philosophy, in detachment. But the candles still burned, the wine still poured, and the companions still waited. They memorized footsteps, smiles, habits. They knew who tipped, who lingered, who wept when they thought no one heard. Their knowledge was quiet, but vast, and though history does not name them, their presence shaped Rome's rhythm, one evening at a time. The fire is low now, the coals are dim. The sky above Rome has darkened, not in punishment, not in fear, but in rest. The day's dust has settled. The stone streets are quiet. What remains are echoes, soft ones, like footsteps faded into silence, like laughter heard once and never again, like a name whispered on a wall that no longer stands. You have walked through narrow doorways, through ash-covered rooms, through mosaics and incense and memory. You have stood beside those who waited, who worked, who watched, and who endured. You have seen the painted walls of the lupanar, the rough beds, the careful gestures, the lives lived in routine, in rhythm, in the glow of lamps that burned long past midnight. You have passed temples, their altars dusted with offerings, their servants preparing for rituals half remembered, and yet deeply human, the blurred space between sacred and served. You have wandered into the villas of Rome's elite, where pleasure was a performance, where status whispered behind closed doors, where the most powerful men were still men, still searching, still afraid. And through it all, you have listened, not to glory, not to triumph, but to presence, to the quiet proof that they were here. They lived, they mattered, not because of conquest, but because they endured. The ash did not ask permission. The mountain did not announce itself. It simply came, and in doing so, preserved a fragment, a breath, a sigh between shifts. And now, as your breath slows, as your body sinks deeper into rest, you are not alone. You carry with you the memory of forgotten names, of hands that worked, of songs once sung in dim corridors, and in the stillness there is no shame, only the soft rhythm of lives lived out in the margins, a rhythm you have felt and followed. The stars shift overhead. Time, like wax, softens. The city sleeps again, and so do you. Let it all drift now. The stone, the sandals, the candlelight, let it fade. There is nothing more to reach for, only silence, only sleep, only the long, gentle breath of history resting with you, tonight and always. Good night.